and especially for this enormously important and exciting topic that we have tonight. My job is just to welcome you. I'll give an award for the person who traveled the farthest. That would be my colleague, Charlie Travis, who came from Dublin. I think he beats. Somebody do the math here. You're from Buenos Aires? Colombia. Colombia? Somebody do the math, or maybe you'll have to share the award. My other excellent, great news is that I can now officially tell you that one of your organizers for this conference today and tomorrow, Alberto Ortiz Diaz, is a winner of the 2024 American Learned Council Society's grant. This is a very big deal. He's one of 60 out of over 1,000 applicants. Well deserved, and we're very excited and happy for him. I'm now going to turn the stage over to Alberto so that he can introduce tonight's speaker. Thanks, y'all.
Eu gosto de aparecer.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us tonight, taking the time. Your presence is appreciated. Welcome to the 58th Annual Walter Prescott Webb Lecture Series, co-sponsored by the UTA History Department, the Disability Studies Minor, and the Student Access and Resource Center. American Sign Language and CART open captioning are being provided for tonight's keynote and tomorrow's lectures. We appreciate that collaboration very much. As the UTA History Department Chair Stephanie Cole mentioned, I'm Alberto Ortiz Diaz, Assistant Professor of History in the UTA History Department. And every year since 1965, our department has sponsored an annual series of lectures in memory of the late Walter Prescott Webb, one of the 20th century's most prominent and influential historians. Over the years, the Webb Lecture Series has spotlighted all kinds of histories: gender, sexuality, migration, deportation, technology, abolition and emancipation, race, empires, revolutions, religion, sports, Cold War, disability, and so on. And it has primarily done so within particular world regions or units of analysis like the Atlantic world. This year, the series is focusing on what I believe may be the first histories of health, medicine, science, and the global longue durée, which we'll unpack a bit more tomorrow in the opening remarks. I must note here that this year's series would not have been possible without the many unseen and seen contributions of UTA History Department Office Manager and Marketing Director Julie Hazard, Administrative Assistant Jordan Wolcott, and Communications Assistant Joseph Carpenter. Thank you, Julie, Joe, and Joe, for all you do for our department and by extension the university. Similarly, I would like to thank the co-organizer of this year's series, the venerable Dr. John Garrigus, who has shown me incomparable warmth and collegiality since I arrived here a few years ago, as well as Doctors Sarah Rose and Paulina Hortono, both of whom graciously agreed to participate in this year's series in different capacities. Certainly, our chair, Stephanie Cole, has also guided the organizational work that has gone into the Webb's this cycle. Our keynote speaker this early evening is Dr. Pablo Gomez, Associate Professor of History and Medical History and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Gomez earned his PhD in history from Vanderbilt University. Before becoming a historian, he earned his medical degree at the Universidad CES and did his residency in orthopedic surgery at the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. He has been the recipient, among others, of American Council of Learned Societies Fellowships, the H.I. Romness Faculty Fellowship at Wisconsin, and most recently, a National Endowment for the Humanities Collaborative Research Grant. His work focuses on the history of knowledge, science, and health and the body in Latin America, the Caribbean, African diaspora, and more generally, the Iberian and Black Atlantic worlds. His first book, The Experiential Caribbean, Creating Knowledge and Healing of the Early Modern Atlantis, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2017 and won several prizes and recognitions as a result. In this instant classic, The Experiential Caribbean, we learn about a creative rendering of the worlds of Black health practitioners ensnared by the Spanish Inquisition. The book creatively explores belief-making and the creation of evidence around the human body, the natural world, and the early modern period. Professor Gomez's edited volume with fellow historian of medicine, Diego Armas, The Gray Zones of Medicine, Healers and History in Latin America, was published by the University of Pittsburgh Press in 2021. Also uniquely compelling, The Gray Zones examines how unlicensed health practitioners shape Latin American history from colonial times to the present. Dr. Gomez is currently leading a project on a reframing of global histories of science, medicine, and technology, which is what Dr. John Garrigus and I are aiming to do with this year's Webb lecture series as well. Hence, part of the reason why Professor Gomez is here with us tonight and tomorrow, as well as the other esteemed lecturers who will be speaking tomorrow. Dr. Gomez is also actively involved in projects of digital archival preservation in Colombia, Cuba, and Brazil, work that makes the kind of scholarship at the core of this year's Webb's possible. Tonight, his lecture will trace the trajectory of his historical work to date, what I call his intellectual constellation in formation. In it, he explores how the many histories of the African diaspora have intersected and shaped historical developments related to health practices and ideas about corporate reality. He focuses on the changes in how historians have engaged with the history of bodies emerging from the Black Atlantic. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were not obviously only the racialized chattel of yesteryear histories of the early modern era. As several works over the past few decades have made clear, Africans and their descendants created rich life worlds in the Atlantic whose exploration, Dr. Gomez and others have been suggesting for some time now, is crucial to understanding the formation of knowledge-making practices about the natural world in the 17th century. Such recognition, he argues, allows us to reposition historical actors, such as 17th century Black people, as effectual agents of a material world from which they have been metaphysically exiled in most existent historical narratives. Not only were they agents or reacted to this material world, however, they were also rightful innovators and shapers of its contours. In addition to the crucial incorporation of African diasporic ways of knowing the natural world into narratives about the histories of knowledge production in the Atlantic, Professor Gomez believes it is also essential to explore how the history of the slave trade is part of the creation of the language of the early modern state, how it works, and the modeling of fundamental ideas for biomedicine and science. Part of this discussion entails elaborating on where his rich research has gone as of late and where it is now anchored. To that end, in this lecture, we will also get a sneak peek at some of the evidence Dr. Gomez has compiled and is assessing for his second book, A History of the Quantifiable Body and the Development of Novel Ideas about Risk, Labor, and Disease that appeared in Atlantic slave markets during the 17th century. All his accolades and what he will lecture about tonight aside, I would be remiss if I did not say a few words about him as a person and what to me are some of his finer attributes. In step with the Wisconsin history tradition, he does the work. There is no question about that. But more important, he is inscrutably caring and has a generous spirit, very much in the mold of Wisconsin's great Latin Americanists, including Florencia Mallon, Steve Stern, Francisco Scarano, and James Sweet. This is no small feat for those who are in the know. So without further ado, it is my honor and privilege to present my mentor, my colleague, and my friend, Dr. Pablo Gomez.
Okay, so can you guys hear me okay? This is without any doubt the most generous introduction that I've ever been the recipient of. Thank you so much, Alberto. It's wonderful being here. It's a little bit of a homecoming for me. I spent the first year out of grad school here in the Metroplex at TCU, and I see so many friends and that I met both here from UTA and from TCU, from SMU. So it is really, really wonderful being back. And I want to start by thanking the Department of History, and in particular Alberto, John, Stephanie, Sarah, for the invitation and for putting this event together. It's truly an honor. And also thank you to Joe and and Julia for helping with all the logistics, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk today, as Alberto said, about both book that I'm finishing. I just finished that kind of dreaded first draft, so I'm very happy about that, and which is on the history of the transatlantic slave trade and the emergence of biomedically quantifiable bodies, and the work that I and others have been doing during the past decades on the history of medicine and bodies and the history of the African diaspora more broadly. It's not only the history of the transatlantic slave trade as such. It is something that is broader, that is larger. As Alberto said, is something I've been very interested in. This is a world that has existed outside of the histories of science, medicine, and technology, a world that it is by far, I think, the largest space for knowledge making in the Atlantic world. We're thinking about the numbers of people involved, and I will be talking more about this in a second. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions, comments, and conversations afterwards. So this is the map of the talk. So I'm going to start talking about that kind of the past, I would say, 2 decades of medical history, and what are the sort of things that I see as the big changes that have been happening, and how my work and those of others, including many in this room actually, have been shaping and modifying that sort of trajectory of medical history and what we think history of medicine and sciences are. And then I'm going to start talking a little bit about the project that I'm finishing, what is at stake, I believe. I'm going to give you a couple of examples from the book, historical evidence. One is talking about specific about arithmetic tables developed in that space of the Black Atlantic. And then I'm going to be focusing on one of the most, for me, horrifying aspects of that space, one that I think is at the center, actually, of the histories of bodies, modern bodies. It's just something that we don't think as being at the center, which is the measuring of enslaved bodies in the Atlantic, and what I think is the largest project of quantification happening before the emergence of the modern state. And I'll be talking more about that in a second. And I'm going to finish with some remarks at the end, kind of summarizing where we are at. I think that is going to take me about 35 minutes, and I hope there is enough time at the end for questions and, again, for your comments. And I want to start by situating that history of the African diaspora and the transatlantic slave trade at the center of the histories of the emergence of modern notions of corporality. So until perhaps 1 decade ago, if we wanted to study the history of early modern bodies and medicine, these will be the kind of books that you will be taught, and that actually I read when I was doing undergrad and grad school, books that are all excellent and very important if one is thinking specifically about the narrative of the history of medicine as learned through Euro-American, European kind of the history of the Renaissance, the history of the emergence of the biomedical quantifiable body. So the histories of British doctor, the history of French doctors, And this is actually something that is still, a couple of these volumes are not that old. I mean, we have classics here like Mighty Few Souls, Nancy C. Acid, but some of these are much more recent. And they again, they're rich histories and they're very important histories that focus on a certain kind of body of archival work that depends on both printed works and that creates kind of a certain narrative that goes from Hippocrates and Galen all the way to biomedicine today, right? Like, so my intervention, or not only my intervention, I think the intervention, many people are saying like, what happens when we start thinking outside of what is in reality a very limited space of healing and thinking about the body that is happening in Europe and the Americas? What happens when one thinks about the world more broadly? And not only that, all the people involved. So by the early 2000s, there was some emerging literature that was arguing for the incorporations of people that were not usually at the center. This story was also very Central European, and it was also very much, or if we included Southern Europe, it was mostly about Italy or England, right? Like so, and that was even truer of the histories of science. So by the early 2000s, you have the work of people like Jorge Cañizares Guerra, Maria Portuondo, Antonio Barrera, saying, Iberians were also scientists, right? Like we're also like doing natural history. They were also doing these kind of projects. But this is a very different sort of thing to say that there is something existing outside of it. This is like saying, okay, there were Europeans of Iberian descent or Creole Europeans living in the Americas that were also part of that kind of history of science properly done. So that is a different thing from what I believe, right, what needed to happen, which is that the emergence of modern notions of corporality has to think about, I work on the history of the African diaspora, but there are many other kind of ontologies here that need to be brought into included Amerindian, Native American, East Asian, South Asian cosmologies and worlds of being, right, like that need to be incorporated into this history, which is, I think, where the field has been going. And I think 20 years ago, when we were discussing those work of Nancy C. Dass's existing, my own book would have been unthinkable to be part of that narrative, right? Like it would have been. This is my book is a book about people of African descent, knowledge creators living in the Caribbean, but not working in any of these traditions. These are not collectors of data to be incorporated into the scientific project. These are people who are creating their own worlds, their own epistemologies, healing on their own terms. And it's a history that should matter on their own terms. And I think that is true of all the people that I kind of, this is just a kind of a small sampling of all the people who have been working on this, including, again, people in this room like Elise, like John, who's fabulous in the last book is, I hope not last, latest book, right, John? It speaks very directly, right, like to the power, right, like of thinking with those histories on their own terms, right, like and for their own purposes. So in other words, that this not depends on the narrative of persistence or incorporation, or it's just like it matters and should matter on its own. So I think that these are some good examples of that. And I think that, as Alberto said, engaging with that history allows for writing histories of knowledge making that avoids paternalistic attempts at inclusivity that, from my point of view, that might be controversial, but I think it's paternalistic that the only way that these histories can be included in the so-called global term, the histories of medicine and science, is through incorporation of the others as either proto-scientists or data collectors in the usual narratives of science and medicine. This is a different thing, and I think this is a richer kind of histories that we can talk. So in doing so, we see that the historical actors that should be at the center of the narrative are not like natural historians, surgeons, physicians, but rather people like enslaved and free people of color that are invested in world-making projects for their own purposes and interests. The bottom line for me is that this history matters on its own as one of the most remarkable projects related to the imagination of human corporality, health, and disease. One that ensued, and this is the other thing that is amazing, many of these histories of creativity, they're happening in the midst of one of the most horrific episodes, right? Like, in terms of both the number of people involved, the number of people killed, maimed, disjointed, that is the history of the transatlantic slave trade. And that is happening in the study space is even more remarkable. And today, what I want to do is to share with you another aspect of that work that I've been doing on the history of corporality and in the world of the transatlantic slave trade. And And these are some of the archives that have been examined in this project. And I want to underscore that the history that emerges out of these archives is one that is shaped by the violence of colonialism and enslavement, but it's one that is very different than the one that appears in the documents belonging to the history of medical printed texts or learned trained practitioners that I just mentioned. It is it's a type of history that in all of its violence tells something very different that thinking about the history of corporality, right, than those that appear in famous works, right, like on famous printed texts, like this one that probably many of you know, right, the famous De Humanis Corporis Fabrica by Andrea Vesali, one of the centers, the text that is at the center of the anatomy Renaissance history, right, like, of modern medicine. I will argue that the records that we have in the archives of the slave trade are as important as Vesalius in also making sure that we understand that the brutal and violent war of slavery was, and again, you might disagree with me, but I think that it was even more foundational for the type of thinking about human bodies that rule our extractive political economy and biomedical spaces today. We just have been averting our eyes to the horrors of this history, and I think that that incorporation is fundamental for understanding how is that we ended up where we are. Let's see if I can convince you of that during the next minutes. So this is what I think is at stake, and so this is what I'm kind of going to situate the project and kind of in the historiography that exists. So the project and the book departs from the idea that the imagination of here we go. The quantifiable universal human bodies during the early modern era was the fundamental epistemological transformation that allowed for the emergence of epidemiology, demographics, public health, and more broadly scientific approaches for studying human corporality. So this is what the standard historiography will tell us, that at the end of the 17th century, something changed, right? Like that instead of seeing people as individual, we're seeing people as universal, that we can see, we can count numbers, and we can kind of move, bodies become fungible, in other words. And in short, I argue that the basic grammar of numerable universal astrocorporality first appeared in the early slave trading world to the Americas. Independent of its origin, as I said before, there is an agreement among historians that the shift of seeing any person as naturally unique to naturally common is one of the marks of modernity. So numbers, the quantification of risk, disease, and death provided the underlying link between natural law, biology, and the human body. In other words, without thinking of the bodies as quantifiable, as fungible, you cannot think about biomedicine, you cannot think about epidemiology, you cannot think about public health. And that literature is linking this narrative related to these developments through the history of physiology and biomechanics, the appearance of hospitals as houses of science, famously Hotel Dieu in Paris, the rise of nosology, the turn in Mater America, the history of smallpox vaccination like Andrea Rosnock, the history of life insurance, among many others. Through the early modern era, according to this literature, human bodies and population became natural for members of elite learned circles in Northern European societies, something to be celebrated as a promise a deductive, quote-unquote, objective approach to the ideation of superior knowledge about human bodies. And as compelling as it might seem, this narrative about quantifiable flesh is strangely disembodied in its clean teleology that links science, capitalism, and colonialism with the rise of commercial empires in Northern Europe. It depends on a logic about the natural way in which bodies are really apposite for being quantifiable. But there is really nothing natural about numbering people or partitioning them into groups. This is not something that happens ex nihilo. There is a logic here that informs how these projects became possible. Numbers are not uniquely logical or objective conduits for sifting or taxonomizing human beings. They are not universal markers for stating matters of life, disease, age, gender, or death. They became to us. And I think that is something that comes very natural to us to think about the statistics. All of us saw the curves of COVID going up and down, like numbers of morbidity and mortality. What is behind those numbers? How is that we came to be conversant, all of us in that? There's nothing, there's a history to this, in other words. And this is not to deny all the power of biomedical approaches, right, like of epidemiological approaches, right? One thing is to say, but the other thing is to say, what is behind, what allows for that? So the history that I'm tracing in the book is not one that is based numbers. I don't know why this keeps doing this thing. Like he's anxious, I guess, to move to the next slide. is not one based in numbers as much as it examines these numbers of violence. And in here, my work is also in conversation with that of a number of scholars like Jennifer Morgan and Catherine McKittrick, in signaling to the violences that numbers perpetrated and continue to perpetrate in the archives of the slave trade. Numbers that, of course, do not contain the history of human beings. And this is indeed, I hope you understand, one of my work's main points. And I'm working already with my colleague Adriana Chira from Emory on another project. This is the one that Alberto mentioned, where we examine archives of the 18th century Spanish Caribbean to provide a different view of history of value making, individuality, and political belonging in relationship to the body, and the role of people of African descent had in it. So in other words, how people in the receiving end of the process that I'm going to be describing today also thought about this and incorporated them into their own ways of being in the world. So in another space of thinking about like different epistemological spaces, different ontologies. So I'm interested, in other words, in putting the brutal history of the slave trade and the genocide of millions of human beings at the center of that foundational elements of biomedicine and public health. And I also want to say that medical historians have examined the history of the slave trade, right? Like, it's not as we are the first people doing that, but they have done mainly, and this is very important work, including some of the colleagues that I admire the most, people like Rana Hogar, people like Suman Seth. There is also this fabulous volume on medicine and healing in the age of slavery. At least you have a chapter there too, right? So, which is basically examining the history of slavery to think about both the horrors of medical experimentation, the horrors of the emergence of medicine, particularly here in the south of the United States, and racism, right? But it is not something that is talking about like what I think it is, what I'm going to discuss here, how this is something that emerges and informs all of the foundational elements of biomedicine, not only those related to race. So is that a question? So let's go to the evidence here. So most of us don't usually think of the Iberian Atlantic or the early Caribbean as a place ruled by numbers, or where numbers occupied an important epistemic positionality. But thousands of individuals on both sides of the Atlantic in Europe, Africa, and the Americas had come to understand that mastering the properties of numbers was fundamental for making sense of the social, economic, political, and natural worlds. Numbers were essential for accurately and honestly engaging in commerce, politics, and for inscribing in paper the characteristics of the material world. As other merchants, slave traders, including those in the Casa de la Contratación, the House of Trade in Seville, the most important commercial entity of the 16th and 17th century in Europe, borrow heavily from the epistemic practices of Italian financiers in the imagination of their enterprises. So I spent a lot of time talking about the emergence of double entry bookkeeping as part of that process, and I'll be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. The financial system that supported the Atlantic slave trade relied on banking and lending institutions with deep roots in trading circles already established in the Mediterranean world through the late Middle Ages and the 15th century. So a lot of this technology, including the works of Pacioli and others, became incorporated into how the House of Trade accountants were trained in Iberia throughout the 16th century. And as a matter of fact, Spain, way before England or the Netherlands, was the first colonial empire that incorporated these practices to be at the center of the managing of the workings of the empire. Something that we don't think too much about it, but there were contadores, there were accountants in spaces in Spanish America where there were not even missionaries. When you think about Spain, you usually think about like missionaries, you think about like theology, you don't think about accountants. And there were places in Remedios where you wouldn't see a priest, but they were the guy, the treasurer, the guy counting coins. That is the guy that is going to be there. So those networks and of expertise in dealing with bodies inscribed in the millions of folios like those depicted here, the bodies of enslaved Africans. And those did not only revolve around European institutions. What I'm saying here, these are some of the records that I'm dealing with here. Some of those come from records of Contaduría, right, like in the Archivo General de Indias, but others actually come from private records of enslaved traders that I've been fortunate to find. So in other words, slave traders had direct contacts with large groups of merchants in West Central Africa and West Africa and invested in the slave trade from the Caribbean and Brazil. They paid cash to shipmasters of vessels that brought slaves directly to them from Sao Tome, Cabo Verde, and Luanda, among other places, here Atlantic Islands, West Africa, West Central Africa, into the Caribbean, Cuba, and the northern part of South America. The need for body quantification then emerges in the world of commerce and accounting of the Atlantic. Paraphrasing Theodore Porter, the concept I'll be describing became a tool for overcoming distance and distrust in an increasingly complex world of finance and commerce. And here I'm not talking, this is the thing that I want to make emphasis in. These are not small groups of people. When you think about the slave trade, okay, a small group of companies doing this and 2 or 3 individuals. Most people living in places like Cartagena de Indias in what today is Colombia, or Luanda, or Cacheo, or Seville, or Lisbon, most people actually invested in one way or another through contacts, through resources in the slave trade. They knew that this was happening. And this is something that will happen throughout the 17th and 18th century. As John knows, right, like thinking about like Saint-Domingue, for instance, the economies of places like Bordeaux, Nantes, they were intrinsically linked. So it is easy to think about this is happening in the periphery of Europe. This is at the center of European societies. And that were, obviously, as I mentioned before, it was not only around the loans that were being made in Madrid and Lisbon. We have Italian financiers. Amsterdam, as I will show you in a second, had a number of transactions, communities invested in this. So there are these bodies and their concepts around them are circulating around that Atlantic world. So this is not a small number of people. That is also something important. So, for instance, the terminology and the ideas that I'm going to be talking about encompass investors in all main Iberian cities, but also, like I show here, in places like Amsterdam. These are some of the transactions that are being used in notaries in Amsterdam itself, and you'll see me using concepts like the piece of index, the pieza de index. I'm going to be talking about the pieza in a second, but just remember that this is in a transaction between private individuals happening in Amsterdam itself. That is true of Rotterdam, and that was true of other places in Amsterdam, but it's true of London, Paris, and other spaces. And it was certainly true in Cartagena de Indias, New Kingdom of Granada, in what today is Colombia, a place that was at the center of that war. And you can see it here in the northern part of Colombia. Cartagena was by then the main slave entrepot in the Americas. And just as a reminder, the Spanish Caribbean was the region that up to the late 17th century received the lion's share of all the slave trade coming into the New World. It is Cartagena, it is the Spanish Caribbean, it is not Brazil, it is not the French Caribbean, it is not the British Caribbean, and it's certainly not North America, right? Like, it is the Spanish Caribbean. So if we're thinking about the history of the slave trade up to the 1670s, this is the place that you should be looking at. And the other thing that I think it is important to underscore here is that, as I said before, these networks are international. So the concept that these people developed, they're going to be foundational, right, for the ways in which slave traders afterwards will start thinking about the commerce of human beings, the organization, and the epistemological spaces that they will think of. Okay, so that is also something I want to emphasize. Slave traders in the 16th and 17th century in Spanish America, all of whom have factors, representatives in Cartagena, were close followers of the process of the double entry bookkeeping revolution that I just mentioned before. Inquisition inventories of their possessions, like this one of one Juan Rodriguez Mesa from 1636, list books of caja y cuenta, libros de caja y cuenta, as the double entry bookkeeping method was known in Castilla, and multiple notebooks that were they recorded everyday transactions that were essential, a part of the double entry bookkeeping tradition. These inventories also listed the book collections of people like Blas de Paz, Pinto, Rodriguez, or Manuel Bautista Perez, some of the most important slave traders of the early 17th century. And they show that slave traders were using state-of-the-art accounting and arithmetic techniques, including Juan de Solórzano's book, Juan de Pérez de Moya, Aritmética Práctica y Especulativa, Miguel Jerónimo de Santa Cruz del Dorado Contador, and others that I list here. Just what I want to signal here that they are really, if you're thinking about state-of-the-art mathematics, arithmetics, I should say, state-of-the-art arithmetics and accounting techniques, these guys were on top of it. Slave traders in Cartagena, underrepresented on the other side of the Atlantic world. So this is more evident even so in Seville, the commercial hub of the mercantilistic Spanish Empire. These methods were at the center of all the books submitted by royal functionaries supervising taxes and the finances of the slave trade from the Americas to the famous House of Trade, which, as I said before, was the largest and most important commercial institution of the Iberian world during the 16th and 17th century, and the Council of the Indies, which is the administrative counterpart in Madrid. So the use of accounting methodologies is also evident in this document, which is a table. One of the technologies that the historians of science have located firmly at the center of the Francis Bacon revolutions of the 17th century. So this is one of the things that if you are doing history of science, they will tell you, right? Like tables are the center of how historical process of thinking and changing about like types of knowledge making emerge. And this is the sort of thing that accountants were doing, specifically in dealing with human bodies already by the beginning of the 17th century in places like Cartagena, the Indias. And this one is one of 12 containing a rich document signed by Miguel Corcuera, who is the major accountant, the principal accountant of the Spanish crown in the New Kingdom of Granada to the House of Trade. And this was a scheme that would allow the king to trade directly with higher slave traders instead of dealing with intermediaries. To summarize, the entire scheme, and this is something I want to emphasize, this is a scheme, these are ideas. These are not bodies that are already, or enslaved Africans that are already present in Cartagena. The entire scheme proposed by Corcuera was based on the naturalized and mathematized possibilities of not yet purchased enslaved African bodies and diseases. His calculations depended on the quantification of generalized groups of human beings that slave traders like Corcuera call lotes, as related to origins, health, and how related to profit in terms of possibilities for labor and the risk of they becoming sick and dying enslaved Africans. They predicted mortality. So and this is based on data that they have been collecting for decades. They will say that 10% of enslaved people most likely will die during the Middle Passage. And again, I'm emphasizing here that they're collecting numbers. They're actually interviewing slave traders themselves. This is just one example of many that you have in the many contracts that they will do. Some of them will call avenza, some of them they will actually do in West Africa proper, and in which the contract will have similar conditions to the one that I have here. He also made projections of labor, productivity, and human lifespan in this document, how such projections will produce gains for the crown on the basis of interest that enslaved African purchasers would pay for loans after 5 years. So you can have here the 1, 2, 3, 5 years and the number of maravedis that you will make on the basis of those. These types of computations, the ones that Corcuera articulated by the beginning of the 17th century, are the very same one that the existing literature argue were part of the innovations of political economics and life insurance tables in the 17th and 18th century. Some of you might be familiar with the literature on the John Brown's Natural and Political Observations and William Petty. This is kind of the foundational projects of political arithmetics, and it has been at the center of the ideation of economics as we understand them to be today. So those innovations that gave rise to possibilities of demographic and epidemiological computations later in the 19th century. I'll be happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, but I want to emphasize how fundamental is that we are talking about this several decades later, at least 1 century before John Brown and William Petty are doing the same, with the exception, right, that the ways in which John Brown history is told, the same with William Petty, is happening in a learned space in England. This is the famous tables of mortality in London, and it is happening in the context of the Royal Society of Fellows, the circulation. This is basically a scientific revolution, if you think it's related to bodies. So these are the two contrasts, right? Like one is slave traders and the schemes for the slave traders in the Caribbean. The other one, the Society of Fellows in London. And let me, it was in this context, let me briefly describe in this last part of the talk, one of the thousands of examples that are dispersed in archives coming from the America that emphasize the use of a concept that was at the center of all this project, which is an abstract concept of corporality. This is not putting prices on human beings. This is thinking about them in relationship to value, and a value that is based on universalized standards. It is the concept of the PSA or the PSA, the Indians. And I have a lot of chapters when I discuss, a couple of chapters where I discuss really the differences between traditional understandings of the issue of the pieza, right? Like how it emerges. And I'll be happy also to talk about that. Let me just briefly say that it is not, I believe, uniquely related to the exchanges of fabrics, right? Like in West and West Central Africa has been traditionally told. I think it has to do with actually technologies of maritime transportation organization of enslaved ship. These armazones, monstrous armazones, as I will call them. I'll be happy to talk more about that. So let me give you an example so you know how that this is happening kind of on the ground in a space like Cartagena. Sorry, let's move my water here. When Alberto was introducing me, I was afraid that I will not be able to go through the whole thing. Thank you, Alberto, again. So how that happened in Cartagena? So this is I'm going to tell the story of example of a ship that arrived in Cartagena, Indias on September 5th, 1663, bringing African captives. The ship was like the Nuestra Señora del Buen Suceso. And it arrived on Cartagena, and here is the very schematic map of the city. This is the port where enslaved Africans arrived. And after arriving, Spanish officials put in motion a well-rehearsed protocol, one designed for the disembarkment of ships like the Nuestra Señora. She was one of the thousands of vessels that had arrived over the past century bringing enslaved Africans. The procedures that actually, like the Portugal codify in handwritten documents that they passed down generations of assessors of the flesh in the slave entrepreneur in the Americas were nothing more than the standardization of tacit knowledge that slave trading communities have developed around the Atlantic over decades. This is the thing with Pamela Smith, a very famous historian of science, who have been talking about that idea of tacit knowledge, something that is not written, something that is not printed, but is kind of taught. So what I'm saying here is that what you see in this document is something that slave traders had been doing literally hands-on for centuries in all of their horror, as a matter of fact. These procedures allow for the actualizations of captive and forced laborers in the paperwork of the Spanish Empire, ostensibly by their taxation. So this is another part of the process that is important. It's also the largest project of incorporation of numbers related to people until the emergence of the modern state in the paperwork of the state. This is crucial, right? Like the fact that you can think about people in the workings of the state as numbers, it is something that is also novel. And if you go to the Archivo General de Indias, those of you who work on the Spanish in the Spanish Empire history, most people actually spend most of the time looking about legajos related to juicios or to civil trials or to reports. The vast majority of those legajos are about numbers, are about this. The other thing that most people don't realize is that the majority of the people arriving in the Americas as a whole after the late 17th century were forced immigrants, were enslaved people coming from Africa. They were not Europeans, they were people coming from Africa. So what we're talking about here is perhaps the largest project of incorporation of people into the workings of the state up to the emergence of the modern state in the 19th century in the Americas as a whole. The process that I'm going to be talking about, again, was standardized, and crucially, it involved the comparison of all bodies against an imagined standard, the pieza de Indias. So the pieza de Indias, here you have an example of a transaction in Madrid, again, between particulars. The pieza de Indias was a male enslaved person of at least 7 cuartas. This is a measurement in early modern Castilla, was 5 feet approximately, between 18 and 35 years of age, and without any diseases. In Cartagena, going back to Cartagena, the Portugal and other crown officials, together with the factors, the representative of the slave traders, divided in group that arrived that day, and those that measure 7 cuartas, and who could be considered piezas de Indias, and those who did not. And it was a multitude. So that day, 674 human beings entered the paperwork of the Spanish state, and they called them heads. All the language that you hear and that you see in the archive is completely humanizing. This is the other thing that every time you read and you work through the paperwork, you realize that the numbers themselves, they go with the actual kind of moving away of the dehumanization of the human body. But this is something that is also crucial, right? Like in the ability of you to think in terms of numbers rather than thinking about human beings, you're doing something profoundly violent. And the terminologies that they use is related to that. So they were thinking about cabezas, or as they would say, heads. And for measuring these 674 human beings, royal officials use a measuring stick of 7 cuartas. And they specifically said that the official almotacen of the city have crafted the stick. The almotacen was a public official in charge of establishing and regulating measurements. The instruments used for the measurement of enslaved people's height were, in other words, also standardized. So you have standards of an idealized person, but you also have standards of measurement. And again, this is not about putting prices onto human beings. We know that that has been happening since there is history of the slave trade. This is very different. You are comparing these enslaved people to an ideal and to create value around not only their bodies, but also specific types of diseases, which is what they did next. So up to that point, it was royal officials together with the factors, the ones supervising and agreeing as official witnesses to the action of the measurement. And after that happened, they summoned Antonio del Castillo, in this case, a licensed surgeon who recognized pieza by pieza, piece by piece, all the lot of enslaved people, and found 53 of them who were recognized because they have what they call tachas, defects. The examination, a more intimate this one, proceeded in full view of everyone present. Del Castillo started with the men, and among them he found several people with the following what we call defects. He found people having what we call morphea, which is related to probably scurvy, hernias broken from the navel, a leg larger than the other, dropsy, dysentery, soft skin tumors, twisted and burned ankles, salty flames, abscess in a leg, tumors of the leg jaw, etc., etc. And in doing that reading, there are two things that one has to remember. One is the spacing, which is happening. All of these are naked people in a large plaza. They already have been going through a horrifying procession from the dock to the place where the house of the factor. They're closely inspected, right? Like the children were being separated from their mothers if they were with them, right? Like in kind of another moment of breaking ties that had been happening again and again for these people through the Middle Passage. So it's a scene of unimaginable violence and horror. And that inspection, that touching, that smelling that is happening there is also something that kind of is happening as these scenes are being put and mobilized into numbers. Del Castillo also specifically recorded that enslaved African presented signs of advanced age or malnutrition. They will be discounted, and recorded several all white with white hair and being skinny and quote unquote very, very skinny. So I have gone through hundreds of these records. These are not the exception. This is the norm. All enslaved that are coming into the enslaved people that are coming into the world of the Spanish Empire, they are entering through this procedure. There was, of course, a lot of smuggling of African captives happening throughout the Atlantic and through the Caribbean. That happens throughout both the 16th, 17th century and until the end of the slave trade in the 19th century. But the people who are entering legally, they're entering through this procedure. And here you have an example of how this works. So two of these enslaved Africans, they're kind of conformed to the idea of the standard, so they don't have any discount. And these two people, you have one that has an hernia and is discounted 2.5. And I'm sorry, this is one who has an hernia, is discounted 1.5. And this person has tinea capitis, and is discounted 2.5. So that is how the process works. You discount for the people who have specific diseases or have specific diseases or defects, as they will call it. But the people who are not had any will be counted at 0. So, and here's a table. This is one that I'm working on, just giving you some of the examples of the discounts. This is coming from the thousands of records that I found. I'm not going to bore you with this, but just to give you a sense, right? And the other thing that is remarkable is how standardized this is, how through the records, through the decades, the value, and remember, it's a value, is a specific number. It is constant. Obviously, you will pay taxes on this, but then you will be selling enslaved people in enslaved auctions, and that is where the prices and the actual value as it comes through the economy of the different places will be different. So, being a female or having gray hair meant a reduction of value in 1/4, cloud in 1 eye 2.5, ulcers 1/6, scurvy 2/4, flame 1.5, dropsy 1.5, and enslaved that were considered to be about to be died, they will call alma en boca, huesos en costal, they will be moribund, were valued at half PSI index or zero, right? Like, and this was important also for slave traders because they will pay less taxes. And the procedure focus on height comes not from the theorization of contemporary physicians, but rather from slave trading communities' decades of experience dealing with slave bodies. They knew that height was one of the few standardizable aspects that they could rely on to talk about nutrition, to talk about like histories of health, back in their own home country. So it was something that they could rely on. So it is not an accident, and they did it. Again, we're not talking here about learned physicians. We're talking about slave traders who have been doing this for decades. In the end, the result of that data is what the 674 human beings' bodies were considered to be valued at 609 piezas de indias and 3/4. The scale of this project of bodily quantification was massive. And here you can see the summaries of some other projects. You can see how these are kind of another large document where you see how they have been like mobilizing this procedure through decades of 571 individuals. They were reduced to 509 and 5/4 from 474 individuals. It was discounted to 369 and 2/4. So you see how that works. I mean, again, as I said, this is just some of the examples of these hundreds of these thousands actually of these procedures. Just to give you an idea, from 1663 to 1667, the owners of the monopoly contract of the Spanish crown introduced 20,316 individuals into the Spanish realm. And through the procedure that I just described, the human bodies of these enslaved Africans were, quote unquote, reduced, in the words of traders, to 10,966 piezas and 3/4 and a half. So we're talking here only about 4 years, just to give you an idea of the amount of people that are going through this and the amount of people that are being incorporated into the workings of the slave trade. So the data, the scale of data production was really gargantuan in comparison to other contemporary systems of production of knowledge about the human body. And it's difficult for me to overstate the importance of the development. Up to the late 17th century, as I said before, the majority of people arriving in the Americas was African. Okay, so let me finish up here. So to conclude, the epistemic practices that made possible for the thinking of diseases as identifiable and time and place, as dissectible, and of the body as flesh congeal in a moment to be counted, are a consequence of processes of value creation ideated by the slave trading communities in the Iberian Atlantic. In them, the body emerges as an ahistorical universalizing entity in which it functions as an object of analysis that could be mobilized for economic and later scientific projects. The brutal violence of these procedures also underscores one fact that is often forgotten when examining the history of medical arithmetics. The seemingly pristine and neutral nature of numbers obfuscates the ugly nature of its origins and what they contain. These first numerical proportional values of a disease sprouted out of the horrors of the slave trading house and unimaginable violence that transpired in them. Numbering bodies became an essential and profoundly significant technique in colonial and extractivist processes in the early modern era, ones that laid out the epistemic basis for the emergence of biomedicine public health. The history of the slave body, in other words, traveled the same paths as that of the bodies of modernity. The afterlife of the forms of valuation that 16th and 17th century Iberian slave trading societies started the process through which Europeans economized land and life, but also, as we know, the racialized value of human beings with the privileging of whiteness. Ideas about the bodies of modernity, our bodies, came not from the worlds of political economy, insurance, or medical arithmetics. This notion emerged from physical and intellectual procedures for measuring the bodies of hundreds of thousands of kidnapped and killed Africans and Amerindians sold in docks, slave warehouses, and plazas around the South Atlantic. To put it bluntly, it is about time that we reckon with the intimate relationship between the multitude of consumed bodies of slavery, finances, African diasporic histories of knowledge making, and the history of the universalization of corporality. This history provides a fundamental continuity that transcends ruptures at the center of the history of the separation between modern individuals, our bodies, and the bodies of enslaved Africans and their suffering. Thank you very much.
around questions in the audience ask is that you project as loudly as you can. But do we have any questions for our keynote speaker, starting right here in the front with Dave Lafitte?
Yeah, thank you very much for coming. That was a fascinating talk. I've been watching your work 2 decades now, I think.
Yeah.
My question is kind of specific. Toward the end, you're talking about the term tachas, and that would imply a descuento, a discount on the tax paid on each. So in this use at this point in time, is tachas primarily a designation of an aesthetic defect or a functional defect that would bring the descuento? Because the same term is through the 19th century, and then it's even internalized advertising their own services, late 19th century in Cuba, for example. Someone will advertise themselves as Samis and Thatcher. So does that change over time, or what did it mean?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, that is one of the bottom lines here, right? Obviously, these histories are with us, and they remain, right, like through, I believe, right, like the very basic kind of grammar of that, biomedical bodies, but it also kind of affects people. That is what that second part that I'm talking about you about, the one that I'm starting, is going to be how you internalize that, how you mobilize it for your own purposes, right? Like, but to answer very specifically your question, it's about both kind of functional issues, where like not having a leg, not having a finger, and also aesthetic, what they will call aesthetic touches or defects, right? Like also age, as I said before, gender, et cetera, et cetera. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And it depends, right, like on what kind of scarification, right? Like, and obviously many enslaved Africans themselves will have scarifications for ritual or, specific purposes related to their own ethnicity, right? Like going back to West and West Central Africa, where they came from, right? Like, so some of those were considered to be touches defectos, others were not. And this is a very much embodied, that is our thing, very much embodied process. When you were talking about the slave auctions, right, like that will also consider like whether they will be able to do certain kinds of works, whether they will come in from a specific parts of West and West Central Africa, right, like they will consider to be more prone to escape, right, like, or to revolt. So that is, but that comes at the moment of the auction. That doesn't come here. That is what this is different, because this is about like the body. This is very focused on the body itself.
Did like this contribute to the study of medicine during this time, considering sort of disease, the deaths, or is it like autopsies, like this knowledge on how disease runs?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, we know, right, like actually this is, I think, if anything, an undercounting of the amount of people that will die, right, like from the moment they will be captured, right, like kidnapped in Africa, right, like some people will say that between up to 30% of people will die, right, like from the moment they were captured. I will say that I don't want to give the impression that I believe this is like contribution to quote unquote medical knowledge as as understandings of the transmission of disease, or some that it is that is going to be propped into, I don't know, for instance, the cures of certain kinds of typhus epidemics. The slave traders themselves were preoccupied, right, like with the numbers of people that they will bring, right, like obviously they were, this is a monetary value for them, right, like, but that is the main interest that they have. Some of them became specialists, as a matter of fact, right, like in the treatment of certain kinds of diseases. So they will buy enslaved people. They will be dying of a disease, for instance, that's called bicho. This is a very famous case of one of these enslaved traders in Recife, in Brazil, and they became a specialist in killing them, right, like through techniques that are related more to a Galenic-Hippocratic sort of framework. So this is not biomedical understanding, and many of them were incorporated. The other thing that has to be said is that many of these knowledges that are being developed throughout the Middle Passage and in those spaces also coming from African themselves, right? Like they will be healing, or trying to heal each other, right? Like there were many surgeons, right? Like barber surgeons, especially. There were many of them also of African descent that became specialists, right? Like of sorts in the treatment of those diseases, right? Like, but really was not through kind of that, what we will consider to be like research, right? Like into disease, the way the Middle Passage into. I think you were first. So not, that is not, they were doing they were killing many people. I'm not saying that they were not, really. But the medical experimentation, that there's a lot of work, that very great work that has been done. That was happening mostly like the late 18th century, 19th century. We do know that that was happening both in Africa, but also here in the United States. Right, we do know that that was happening. The bodies famously of enslaved African women or Black women here in the United States were a part of that process. But I don't know if that was kind of that was part of your question. No, there is not. This is not. That is not. There were medical schools, right? Like, and there were, especially in Europe and also in the Americas. But it's very different from what we'll think of as medical schools today. That is what I'm saying. Like, this is happening in a space that is outside of that kind of a space of learning that we understand to be. That is part of what I'm interested in, to asking us to think about that history as also belonging to the history of corporality. All right. Thank you.
Literature, for example, they're doing that. They're talking about organs. So I'm wondering about that project. It sounds different in that sense. You are additional.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering about that project and related processes, because your book is making think also about other processes, earlier processes that were happening in Spanish Empire, I don't know, universalizing bodies, but for example, I was thinking about visitas and how,
Mhm.
one of the interesting these imperial officers visiting the lands they discover is like how many people are there, what's their ages, how many are productive, like how much money, how much things you can extract. So I'm thinking about all of these things that happened earlier, and I'm thinking, what is the relationship with this, even if it's not strictly about it. Also, I'm thinking about, I don't know, gold or silver and those things. So,
Absolutely. So let me start with the second one. Thank you, Lisa, for the question. So this is, as I said before, this is part of a way of thinking about the Iberian world as one that is ruled by these ideas about extractivism, and they come and they're kind of processed, right, like through these techniques, right, like, and in many of those cases, they are specifically interested, right, like in the encomiendas that you were mentioned before, in the visitas. They're interested in counting bodies, right, because for the ability to work in mines, gold mines. Remember that what I'm focusing here on the 17th century, but these processes already start by the middle of the 16th century on. They're already full steam ahead. So they're going hand in hand. The difference here is that you have something that is very much focused specifically on the workings of the human body, and creating something that is also very specific about bodies that were individualized, that were like not existing as universal, that you're making claims about universalization of human bodies. That is also something that is very different. Right? Like it will be very weird for an early modern era to understand that I can talk about our bodies, right, like as something, or the diseases that affect us, right, like in something that can be quantified, that can be thought of as affecting both of us in the same way. That is not something that will be easily understood, right, like somebody thinking in terms of Galenic Hippocratic medicine. So that is kind of answering the second question. And I'm glad you asked the question about origins. I am making these claims not because I believe that there is a smoking gun, or because I'm interested in like saying it is because we don't usually think about this as history of medicine. We don't usually think, in many ways, that is actually similar to what I was doing, right, like in my first projects, and like these are histories of knowledge making in their own right. So this is something that is also related to that. I'm not thinking, but this is something that I didn't say, but I'm glad this is giving up the opportunity to emphasize this. Most of the projects related to the relationship between medicine and the history of kind of the early modern history, they're related to the history of racial capitalism, the history of modernity as emerging right like in the 18th and 19th, 20th century. And what I'm saying here is that these notions actually come from way, way, way back. We're talking about the Middle Ages. We're talking even some of these are actually coming from antiquity. We know that these models of transaction of thinking they're emerging in a mercantilistic world. This is not the world of the globalized British Empire. So they invite different kinds of reflection that are, I think, even more troubling in the sense that they belong, they insert, or say they kind of filter in the making of the ways in which we speak about corporality, both within and outside medical history, right? Like in different ways. So it is not so much as a teleology that goes back to that political economics, arithmetics, and biomedicine, but rather it is going backwards and saying like this has been with us for longer, right? Like, and it has different explanations. One that that I think in a way are harder to reckon with, right? Because it is easier to signal kind of capitalists or enslavers, right, like as belonging to a different world, one that is not ours. But when you say that this actually belongs in different ways in our world, it is different to kind of separate yourself from that. I don't know if that makes sense.
There a librarian corollary to him, a figure that took a lot of this data you're talking about and started mapping it? And then the second part of that, the evaluations of enslaved, were they calibrated to the amount of extraction the enslaved person would bring to, you know, extracting sugar cane or gold or whatever the labor they were.
Yeah. So thank you. About William Petty, I spent a lot of time looking for, because obviously William Petty was living in Amsterdam at the same time that this is happening. So in other words, at the same time that all these kind of loans and all of these transactions are happening at the time of Dutch Brazil, he's actually working in Amsterdam. He went to medical school at Utrecht, right? Like, so also in the Netherlands. So I never found a smoking gun per se, really saying that he was, but he was invested and involved in the world of slavery. That is for absolutely sure. Yeah, oh no, absolutely, I get it, I get it. So we don't. This is the very interesting thing about this, right? Like we don't have somebody like William Petty, right? Like in the Iberian world, and partially it is because the way in which the circulation of knowledge and the creation of knowledge in the Spanish Empire work is very different from the way it work in places like England or the Netherlands, right? Like or in Paris, right? We have the Academy in France, right? Like, most of these actually circulated, was centralized in the Consejo de Indias, in the Casa de la Contratación, in the House of Trade. So this actually ended up in the house of functionaries, of bureaucrats. These are the people who are actually at the core of doing that kind of work. And we don't have, I mean, we don't have that the same sort of either institutions or investment of the crown in these sort of processes. That's why we don't have that William Petty figure. I mean, but we do have people like Corcuera already doing this before that. Yeah, and cartographers, I mean, we do know, right, like, just real quick here, just to show you, we do know that Iberian cartographers were essential part of that work. Maria Portuondo, I don't know if you know this book, she has been like working on this for several decades, and secret science. So actually, but this was actually cartographers that working, literally they were secret maps, because this is the part of that world that it was like, we don't want you to know where we have been going and how we got there. So they have been doing that. There's a lot of cartography doing in the Spanish world. Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yeah, that is absolutely true. That is what I show you that chart when you say like they're calculated in 1 to 5 years. It is about also how much that affect the possibilities for labor, right? Like in the mines, specifically silver and gold mines. I don't think, no, this is way before William Petty. Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, William Petty, what he does is he also, I mean, the point of comparison of departure for his political anatomy of Ireland is enslaved people in Algiers. So he has that in his mind. You have a question? Yes. Mm.
I'm wondering, in your moment, what does dehumanization, not just as an idea, but as I think kind of physical, tutorial practice, what does that look and feel like for, say, the account? Or, I mean, or any other place.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's such a great question, right? Like, and it is one that um, something that also I didn't have time to dwell on is from the moment the slave trade started to Spanish America, there were people denouncing the slave trade. There were people saying, we cannot do this. This is horrible. The conditions under which we are treating our fellow humans. They actually explicitly said this. So there are denunciations happening left and right. It was not only people like Bartolomé de las Casas or Alonso de Sandoval famously writing treatises about this, but many others writing petitions to the crown. And part of what is happening here is that you obviously have a recognition, right, like of humanness. On the other hand, and there is partially the project was justified, right, actually in the humanness and the fact that they were like on the recipient end of process of Christianization. That was ostensibly what was argued, right? Like what you see happening in these records, right? Like what you see happening in them is the first thing that you need to do is actually they don't talk about that aspect of humanity, which was essential part of the conceptualization of being a human being in the Iberian world, specifically, I'm sorry, in the 16th century. So alongside this, you have every time they arrive on Cartagena de Indias, famously they have all the Jesuits that will go there to baptize them. So those are two aspects of that world, right? Like that one is very preoccupied with humanity. These people are not. They're interested specifically in thinking of them as the flesh. That is what it is, specifically in the ways in which they're talking about him, the ways in which they're inscribing him in the records. They're thinking about them, as I said before, as not having a soul. And that is what I think is the crucial aspect here. To be able to put somebody into numbers, you have to de-soul them in a way. And that is what I'm saying, like, have this specific term that is very telling. Alma en boca, huesos en costal. So that specific is soul in your mouth, bones in the sack, because they recognize that there is something that they need to do to take out the soul of the body, specifically in the terminology, in the epistemology that they create, and in the ways that it becomes quantified.
I have one other questions remaining, but you'll have an opportunity to ask those questions to Pablo here during this, which is next door in the control room. And over by the exit, Lee Hazard has coupons in her possession, which I assume will be distributed for the cocktails next door. So for those of you who have questions, please join us and continue the conversation with Pablo. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.